So I think we should start with the historian, Mr. Leonhard. Well, I think it is always a good idea to start with the historians because they talk about something which is the past. But I must say, and maybe this has got some profound sense or deeper meaning because in the profession I come from, based on crises, serious situations, and therefore I have a quite sober look at this. In other words, the crisis, the catastrophe is what happens in history all the time. In 1817, in 1926, in 1784. If you asked people then they would have said in certain constellations, in their words of course, the world is critical. We face particularly difficult times. And I do not want to say belittle the crisis which we are going to talk about now, but we have to be aware that the crisis, that the catastrophe always, emerges based on what we see in the past, the consequences, the repercussions. No person in 1789 said that we are at the beginning of the French Revolution, because only after 1815, or maybe after 1840, or Jakob Burckhardt after 1871 started to think about what has happened, what has been, say, triggered, initiated. Therefore, I would like to warn you that, that in the 20th century, this discourse about crisis has become inflationary. And like Mrs. Flick said, the catastrophe or disaster. The disaster in the late 19th or early 20th century was a war. Why? Because the war was an efficiency test for political, social, economical systems. I wouldn't say that a war is the father of all things, and we certainly do not wish that it will become so. But as a historian, I should say that the war often demonstrates how resilient, how able to learn systems are. Wars also show which systems are superior to others. So maybe this has to do with some kind of alarmism, let me call it this way, what we see or think. I believe in this case the list which Marietta Auer showed us will help us. I should say there are 2 points which I'd like to add to that. One, I just mentioned it today. Nowadays, in historical terms, we see a unique medial and communicative situation in the latest years and decades of the history. We are now witnesses of catastrophes, and we can do so globally. Now, in the 19th or 20th century, people didn't have a chance to do that. But now we can also see the urgency. Things are or this means that the requirements to be met by NGOs, institutions, governments is rising. And we discussed one point intensively. So the difference between what we communicate and say and what states or countries or other systems can do. So maybe there's a widening gap between the two, and it might have to do with the changes taking place in history. We can say the early 20th century without, laying cables at the world, or Arab rebellion, smartphones. All these were revolutions. The second point, and this is the second point I'd like to add, refers to international politics or policies or international relationships. Surely there are certain control mechanisms which are being observed, and what we have to understand right now, maybe particularly from a German perspective, we have to understand that we are now just assessing which securities or safe ways of thinking are just breaking away. What are the new control mechanisms emerging? Now, I think it would be daring to say which the new mechanisms will be. Russia, revisionist power in I don't know how many years, we can say that we will have a multipolar system in this world, very likely so. But we will have problems to say that this is where the European Union has found a good answer to. Now, talking about systems, talking about institutions, talking about processes, I believe we then also have to talk about effects, emotions, because we all see that the belief in institutions is something important. Niklas Luhmann says this is the confidence in the system. I, as a historian, should say that political stable systems always are based on confidence in people. Humans, politicians, players who set up connections, links between processes, institutions, and people representing this. Confidence and trust. Now, talking about institutions, we also have to talk about how people can be made to understand, to get involved, to identify with things. The crisis which we see also has to do with the crisis of democracy, and I believe that we've reached this point, this much so far.
Zusammen, Krisen gab es schon immer.
Let me sum this up. We've had crises all along, but in the 19th and 20th century, we've seen so much peace, but now there's a new form, internationalization, digitalization, globalization. Maybe this is a new type of crisis that we're faced with, a new way of saying that the yardsticks for crises no longer apply to what we have today. Maybe Schön could give us some thoughts. We've got a type of choreography here. The historian knows what things were in the past, and the legal expert knows what it is, and the economist will know what it's going to be. So Mr. Fuest will then, with his crystal ball, will be able to look and tell us what the situation will be. But I'll be a bit more sober and try to take a look at the stabilization of the stabilizing effect of institutions. Are we in a crisis situation like we had in the past? And as Mr. Leonhard said very correctly, this is something that cannot be assessed until after the fact. That's correct. A lot of developments are long-term. For example, Xu Enlai, the Prime Minister of China, said in the 1970s, what did he think about the French Revolution? He said, well, it's too early to tell. So you have to think in very long-term periods. But I would say that the situation is indeed different. It's new. And what is new and different is climate change. We've always had wars in Europe as well. There have always been migration movements in Europe. There were inequalities. There were economic crises. The Germans have a lot of experience with inflation, currency reform, etc., etc. But the climate crisis, which is on the basis of natural laws. This is something that affects the whole world with regard to the increase in the temperature in the atmosphere, in the oceans, on the continents, in the glaciers. This is completely new challenges for us. We've never had challenges like this before. So this is a crisis which is reinforced by all the other crises we're faced with: energy, economic crises, inflation, inequality, etc. But this is the one major challenge. And this is something that we should not play down. This is something where humans can have and take decisions here. So we can say that all of the populists, Donald Trump to the AfD, structurally, they deny this crisis. They say that this is not a problem, climate crisis. And then they come up with calming messages. Things will be back to normal, just like they were in the past, and we can live like we did in the past. But how do our institutions deal with all of this? Marietta, Auer told us about democracy, individual rights, and also the rule of law, etc. These are basically institutions that were set up to secure freedom, securing freedom in individual activities, collective freedom in democracy, collective freedom also with regard to other countries and supranational influences. But these are institutions which cannot manage two things, even though this is asked of them, and that is to say increase in prosperity, and the other one is doing away with the welfare state. A lot of people think that democracy and the rule of law are legitimate because everyone is doing better, economically speaking. And that is the topic of capitalism, which you mentioned, market economic order. That's what they're supposed to do. But this is not this is only part of the whole story. So people will become very nervous when it comes to institutions if there is no increase in prosperity. Although the task of the institutions is much more fundamental. Economic and individual freedom is much more important than if I can fly to the island of Mallorca 3 times a year. So now with the climate crisis, we have to stand up to this. Here we're talking about doing without, for example, no reductions in wages or questions of redistribution if these problems are going to be overcome. So this is where the pressure is especially high. And that is where I am pessimistic. Here we can have the impression, once again, the AfD party in Germany, all of those people join there who do not want to forgo anything. They have the idea that they don't have to forgo anything. Thank you very much, Mr. Schön.
Jetzt schält sich schon so ein bisschen so ein Bild einer gewissermaßen.
Question arises, the cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, we've got the climate crisis as a mega crisis which has never been around, and at the same time we all also talk about democracy, prosperity, wealth. How does all this go together? We think of our little toys and do not want to let them go, and then there are the big things, prosperity, wealth. I believe that's a good keyword for you, the economist. I think it is wonderful at CONVOCO that you meet people here who believe that the economists still, gaze at the crystal balls and know everything. Very nice to hear that. But nevertheless, looking at the crystal ball, Norik Schulerek said he was looking in the crystal ball. He says we live in times where crises become more and more relevant. We face these crises and we have to think of how we can, tackle them, how we can prepare our institutions for these crises. And you see, he said that our approach is not really, so absolutely brilliant. Looking at the future, I believe it makes sense to change an approach, to start reforming our institutions. I believe it's appropriate to say that our situations in the Federal Republic of Germany, but also in Europe, are in a position, and this certainly as a result of the Second World War, and reflecting the wishes of the Allied forces, that we paralyzed ourselves. We've got a federal system and it is very difficult to govern things, but we have a system of checks and balances, a system within which pay a price, i.e. you cannot respond fast in times of crises. Who is responsible for what? Because there are the minister presidents and the chancellors and lots of other responsible officers get together. Then a decision is being taken, and then somebody says, "No, I think the others have been coming up with this idea." So this federalism, this is something which the Germans do not love. The Germans, or let's say the majority of the Germans, they are passionate centralists. They are not federalists. And this has got to do with the fact that the Allied forces at the time said, what happened to our history in the 19th century? Look at the German history. It is, overcoming these small state, landscape on the German territory. And now add to that in times of a crisis, all this doesn't help. I believe that this is a very negative picture. Checks and balances. Federalism means that you prevent politicians to cause damage, and that's a good thing in the first place. But in a crisis, we see that the structures which we have are not ideal ones. So the question for me, the issue for me, looking at the future, is how can we reform things? Is it possible to reform things in the first place? And then, of course, the question has to be, raised to the European level. And many people said, who are the experts who are being consulted when we've got problems here or there? And then people say lobbies have got more influence than, say, the scientists or others. So I believe what we all have experienced and what I've experienced certainly is digitalization, information that here we are in a very, say, very poor position. We do not know about the present, let alone about the future. Collecting data, this is something which we do not very well. And of course, this will also weaken any scientific, say, advisory councils. That's one point. The data, often enough, not available. And the scientists as consultants, I don't know how many are here. All in all, I want to say this is a problem which has been around for quite some time, and looking at the situation, I believe this is a problem which will continue. And this brings me to the end. Maybe we should reform our federalism. I'm also under the impression that we should not give up federalism. I believe we have to add to that, complement it, maybe by something you might call agility. So let's say we've got a specific situation, and then this might also involve changing, modifying, upgrading, updating institutions. That it is not about, minister presidents collecting or meeting in Berlin, and then, maybe there should be something like a national security committee or something like this. So some kind of body which is in a position, or who are in a position to respond in times of crisis quickly. Surely we've gotten certain emergency situations, and of course, the indebtedness cap and things like this have been put into place already. But nevertheless, it's all about thinking whether or not we should change the decision-making processes, and in this way stabilizing our federalism. It's not only about specific situations, but also other things. A direct question to what you just said. Over the last few months, there was an idea which has been broached, setting up a National Security Council where strategic elements, expertise, and political decisions had to be brought together. Now, this was shelved kind of because looking at the structures of the ministerial organizations, it didn't really work. Now, would that be, say, a kind of example, case in point for creating new structures? Well, I'm not a security expert, but when it comes to economic crises, I can imagine to have something like this. And on some levels, I think something of this kind is already in place. A national crisis security council or something like this, maybe they will be in a position to handle things faster. So who is responsible, when things go wrong, and who should lose in the next election? That's something which is not clear. Maybe we can achieve something like this. I believe that this is an interesting question, because talking about the German history, it also means that we have to look at federalism. I don't believe that the Germans want a national state. What they want is good politics, and in certain situations, they want to have a state which is able to act. I've been in Oxford for a very long time. American and British colleagues told me, well, it is very good that you've got a federalism which really works. So, for instance, some things, are being prepared on a lender level so that you have to prove that this or that is good before things are taken up in Berlin and can then be brought to a successful end. Now, one counter argument is, which I said, when it comes to difficult situations, don't you think that the British Premier can respond faster than we can? And there was one response, one reaction, and that was what reminds me of the price France paid. It reminds me of Margaret Thatcher. When Margaret Thatcher entered Downing Street, and the journalist at the time asked her, "What are you going to change?" And she turns around and says, "Everything." So, and after that, many people, are getting scared. And today, I should say, we should have an intense discussion about this, like in the UK, but the central state with a political and administrative elite, separate from the societies, and they may not know any longer what they are doing or what they are deciding upon. Maybe this is something which we see in France. Looking at the historical development, I think, and this has to do with the resilience of democracies, it is the institutionalized coercion to communicate, to finding a compromise, including any moments which will, reveal that things don't work and that you have to change your approach. And this is what I would like to have. We have such a national or federal national council. Maybe it's not that good an idea, but nevertheless, crisis will continue. We will see more. We will make progress in this respect because over the next few years we will have, this small, no matter whether it's the chancellorship or the foreign office, we are no longer allowing this kind of narrow-minded way of thinking, blinkered thinking. They are also historical acceleration or accelerating factors. Today, we think about German federalism in a different way because the coronavirus pandemic showed us where it does not work. But it also means that we have a good organization, a good organization of, say, competition, also of creativity. I believe it is very good, that the performance, say, in Bavaria, mathematics, for instance, here the performance is better than in Bremen, and that this is divulged, that this is made public. So I think that's good. If you look at the various universities in the various länder, what things are good and which things are not so good. So I think this is what we have appreciated. A success story is never a guarantee that you can continue things along these lines. The European Union now is a successful, historically seen. This is a unique peace project. After the Second World War 70s, after the end of the Cold War, has done an enormous job when it comes to pacifying the things. But I cannot say that the European Union is very well, say, equipped for handling the crisis of the future. What I want to say is democracies are able to learn that we can discuss about things like this, federalism, that in the European Union we will discuss about things like, 29 different missile systems, whether we can handle things or organize things in a more efficient way, that we can do something like this, that we can say where money is wasted, where we could be more efficient, where we have to change things. Having a discussion like this means, this is possible in a democracy. Now, during the coronavirus pandemic, here at CONVOCO, we discussed, is an authoritarian regime like China, isn't it better prepared, to face a coronavirus pandemic or crisis? I think we would be a bit more cautious with our judgments or thinkings. And there's something else, because you touched on that. Nature is not everything, but everything is nothing without nature. So this is part of the new crisis tectonics which we see around. We've got a kind of meta crisis which we are facing right now, which will, or is testing all the various, tools, instruments in another way. They have to show that they can really work. And at the same time, we've got many institutions, they are in the midst of a crisis too. We've got stable democracies, stable media. Now, federalist media, they have competition, and they need the competition in order to come up with a creative approach or answer response to the crises. Now, here we've got the meta crisis. This refers to some institutions which are in the midst of a crisis themselves, but they are required to answer to respond to these crises. This much from me.
An das Panel geben.
Very much. And now I'd like to turn to the panel once again. If we have this environmental climate crisis, the meta crisis, and all the crises that we have in the different systems, we've been talking about German federalism for quite some time now. Isn't this maybe one level too low? Maybe we should ask the question, are these institutions appropriate here for democracies? You talked about authoritarian systems and the rivalry when you talked about the corona system, crisis, for instance. Couldn't this also be some way ahead for the future when we talk about how to deal with environmental problems? That's the question. Well, I think I would take this one step further, and I would say that the crisis is not only a global crisis, it's also a crisis which has long-term effects. In other words, this is the first time, if you compare this to an economic crisis, the pandemic, or a nuclear threat, this is a crisis where we need to take action at a point in time where the consequences of the climate crisis have not become aware of all of this amongst the decision makers. And the institutions that we have, large companies, democratically elected instances, they think in terms of 5 years. Performance has to be offered, and a population that thinks in relatively short terms, but we need to take decisions that will have an impact for years or even decades in the future. So we have to think about this long-term aspect. That's a question to both of you. Are we going to manage that with the institutions that we have? Well, what about the time? That's a question for the economists. Well, I could ask the other question. Can we talk about a dictatorship? Has a dictatorship ever been interested in environmental protection? I don't think so. I think we've seen cases where dictatorships in certain countries exist. They have lower income and maybe they have other priorities. But I think you also have to ask the following question when we think about the climate, biodiversity. I think that we have to think about the people who are interested in these matters. I think that indicators we talk about in dictatorships, we see, are they going to hold on to their power? That's something that is very important to them. Will they be able to hold on to their power? That affects the actions they take. And maybe it could be that only in democracies, because people are concerned about their children, and this is also the case in dictatorships as well, but they have nothing to say in a dictatorship. And in democracies, they can articulate themselves. And then we have a political process that develops, and this might not be satisfactory. We've talked about that as well, but these things have at least a chance to come up to the surface. And so that doesn't mean that we can also draw the consequences as a result of this, but at least we talk about it. And I think that I am more convinced of saying I would be more convinced if China would really stop building coal-fired power plants. Then I would say, okay. But I think that if that is a hope for us that maybe authoritarian systems might manage, I'm not sure it is, but I think this is something that we need to consider as well. But we know today very clearly from the history in the 1980s that one major problem for the Soviet Empire was the question of the environmental policy. We also have to think of people experiencing this every day, that this does not have a future. In Heidelberg is where I studied political science. Claes von Weimar, and this was in the beginning of October 1987. He's a famous political scientist, and he gave a lecture in 87 during the winter semester, and he was a guest at the University of Moscow Academy, and he said the Soviet Union will not exist in 5 years' time. And his analysis was the Soviet Union is a multi-ethnic empire. We don't have the Homo Sovieticus. People haven't forgotten the fact that they come from Georgia or they come from the Baltic states. And the second point was, he said, there are huge environmental problems in the Soviet Union, and there is an awareness of this in the public opinion in certain regions where we see that so many babies die, and people die on average at 60 years. So the state is really working on infrastructure and building apartments, but this is where they have failed. And the third point is Afghanistan, the Soviet Vietnam. So here we can say the performance of a country or an empire does in the 20th century depend on environmental questions. I was a guest at the Chinese Academy of Science on 2 occasions, and this is what they do. They give you certain tasks, and my task was, how do empires survive, and how important is the environmental policy in the final phase of empires. So there they probably don't have enough awareness of all of this, but there is interest for it. And in the Western societies, it was in the 1980s, we were talking about follow-up problems following Chernobyl. We were at least aware of the problem and the time involved here. I think there we can say that this tells us something about the fact that the starting point, the adaptability of democracies, is better when compared to authoritarian regimes. It doesn't change the problem, however. I want to say one thing very clearly. Wolfgang Schön is absolutely right. But our focus that we're talking about right now, if we talk about the big picture, that is the history of humanity. It's not the history of nature. Nature is not aware of disasters or crises or emergencies. The long-term history of our planet means, of course, there were phases where huge parts of the world could not be inhabited. What we're talking about here now is that the conditions for survival of humanity. So this is just a footnote, but I think we have to be very precise here. Nature really doesn't care whether we solve these problems or not. Nature will come up with an answer. That is perfectly clear. Nature also has an answer to a major nuclear war or whatever, just to make that point clear. And maybe I can pick up on the Soviet Union once again when we talk about climate protection as something where we have to undertake great efforts. We have to use all sorts of capital. We have to replace power plants with wind farms. So the question is, when in history did we ever have such transformations? One example of a great transformation is the Soviet Union. Stalin, this was between 1930 and 1950, when he really industrialized, he forced industrialization. This was a great buildup of capital, all sorts of victims as well, and sacrifices, but we have a dictatorship that managed such a transformation. It wouldn't have happened on its own. You can see this critically because there were a lot of sacrifices made. But you could ask, could an authoritarian system manage such a transformation today? Could they assert this? I think the problem here is that Stalin was clearly motivated. He wanted to develop his arms industry. He wanted to expand his power and come up with an industrialized society which would then fit with the communistic ideology. But it's really hard to imagine, maybe you don't find it all that difficult, to come up with a green dictatorship. We're talking here about forcing climate protection. I think that's unrealistic, and that's why I think that authoritarian systems, well, I would say that this was Stalin. He made modernization possible for and tangible for everyone. You're talking about the defense, etc. And this was a major role. Here we're talking about organizing a loss of prosperity. And so we're not trying to test to see if dictatorships are better. My question is, how, within a democracy and within the rule of law, how can we improve our institutions? Or how can we react to all of this? The big concern we have is that population is trying to take authority over the institutions and to play down the crises. I have something that Adam Tooze, he was a great economic historian, and I agree with him. This type of crisis that we're now going through, an energy crisis, which is leading us to a new model through decarbonization. This type of crisis has never existed. Everything we've had was wood, burning wood, coal, oil, etc. And now this was all in a carbonized world. What we now have in mind is something which I must say is something there for the first time. We're being confronted with this moving in a totally new direction. We have to have technological developments which we never had before. What you say is absolutely correct. One thing I'd like to add when it comes to authoritarian regimes. In the 20s, in the world economic crisis, we had pilgrimages from American and European intellectuals. They went to the Soviet Union because they said they had solved the problem. And these people are not going to the gulags. The radical modernization was something that only it was 2.5 million people paid for their lives with this. We can't imagine anything like this. But there's something else that's interesting here. And I think that this is also something that shows a lot about what dictatorships are. In economic policy, Stalin had a type of a rational program. He wanted to move the agricultural society to a modern industrialized society, but he is holding on to power. And in the 30s, he then quickly began to take the elite that he needs for the modernization, and he began to liquidate them systematically. In 1939 or 40 or 41, the Soviet Union was a very highly industrialized state, but the Red Army had no commanders because as of 1936, 1937, these were basically all liquidated. So authoritarian regimes are not all that good when it comes to solving individual problems because there are other questions of power that are related to all of this. So take, for example, Xi Jinping in China as an example. Now, as a historian, I get nervous about this. World history is something that he is linking to his own biography. It's a question of what can I achieve in my lifetime? I dare to say that this could be very important for the question regarding Taiwan. This might be a rather dramatizing factor. And the question is, how capable are political systems when it comes to giving up power so that they can maybe become involved in finding a good solution elsewhere? And here, I do not really trust authoritarian regimes very much here. My second comment on this, to what Mr. Wolfgang Schön said, I think that the main problem here may be the apory of democracy. And this is that we have a system where expectations are provoked. In other words, expectation to participate. And this also plays a role, and the integration of media into our society as well. And my impression is that democracies over the last few years or decades have, maybe in Europe and in the United States as well, they have become worse when it comes to managing expectations, telling people that times are going to be more difficult. You have to be prepared for this, prepared to give something up. The successful democracies in the 20s and 30s do that. In the UK, in the Netherlands, in the Czech Republic prior to 1934, in Finland, in the Scandinavian countries, in the United States as well. This works well. Trust and confidence, this is said by credible politicians. We cannot promise that we're going to solve all of the problems. We do believe that the system that we stand up for can, in the long run, make things better for you. And this is something that I said yesterday as well. I'm happy to repeat this. A chancellor who says, I have a plan for everything, no, and it's not going to cost anyone a penny. The state will solve all the major problems. The chancellor is communicating in the wrong way. In the next years or decades, we'll be dealing with how political systems can remain credible by telling people, expecting things and announcing things that are going to come, and things that they will have to face up. And this will also be very decisive when it comes to democracies. So here we see we can only talk about generating prosperity. Well, the problem is the chancellor that says this, or chancellor is this, will they stand up to the competition when people say, why, it's no problem, everything can stay as it is? My personal experience, here we see that it's always the party that the party wins that says things are going to stay as they are. Or as a former chancellor was said, 1990, a lot of people will be better and nobody will have it worse. Nobody will be worse off. That's how you win elections. So the question is our society open enough to have to give up certain things? I would like to make two more points talking about how democracy can work. Number one, the American senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, everybody is entitled to their own opinion. Nobody is entitled to their own facts. So this is something that has to be the basis of our democracy. Everyone has to have the same facts. These have to be accepted as given. You can argue as to the order of magnitude of environmental effects. People don't know that exactly, but we have to have the same facts. This is something which is no longer the case in the United States. All sorts of media communicate all sorts of different truths, and this has been going on for many years now. And the second point is the result of democratic processes have to be accepted and not say simply, no, they won the war, they won the election. All of the authorities, etc., say just the opposite. Trump won the war, won the election. No, this is where we have to say, can we accept these sacrifices? We have to have credible politicians that make these announcements, but people are going to have to give up the common facts, etc.
Fake News ist ja offensichtlich auch Teil dieses Krisenphänomens.
Also have a systemic crisis. We have to rely on the same facts, when talking about climate or climate protection, but this is no longer a given. Well, you see, the historian says, if you look at the 20s and 30s, democracies which fail are democracies within facts and fiction, are kind of merging. It's exactly like you put it. Now, if in parliaments the balance between visible differences and the ability to make compromises doesn't work anymore, and then respect just disappears into thin air, and then you can say that each and every process of deliberations is not the truth. It is no longer considered to be true. So I believe that these are important factors for a democracy. But maybe things are even worse. Nature, climate. It's like this. It's not that we do not see these fake news. And there are parties like the AfD in Germany. It is a fact, the destruction of nature, climate change will continue, and irrespective of whatever we are doing. So why don't we say, okay, we're going to continue like we've done in the past, and then we will see what will happen. But this is not an acceptable viewpoint for any of us. But for that, you don't need any say fake news. But what will happen if we just, forget about our obligations? It doesn't work like this, does it? In principle, we stick to this, but we are not going to do anything in this way or that way. And we just accept, that things will happen like this, and we try to be, to make ourselves a comfortable nest, if you like. There's someone saying, we will continue along these lines. I believe this is very difficult. And, also for a party like the AfD.